So say, how much you made on so far? Where'd you find that? Where you saw you always use that? A lot of times when they send out, they'll like buy in the day before, send out that email, I drop price on you, like, don't do that, price on it. Well,
But they have,
I'm gonna look.
I don't know, but they do have a pretty good show.
I did that for a little bit, like I said, every time I would do it, I'd buy in, I'd sort of send the email out, it would be high. And then we like time to buy in there, it was there. Look,
And these ones are usually good for the
what's the, what type of deal on that email was?
I was kind of annoyed because we got our last choice, but I
Yeah.
think he changed stuff.
Yeah.
Because I looked at
Because
it
that
again.
was not the first preference over there.
Those are nice.
Yeah,
I was
right.
like, you could have possibly done through. But anyways, I looked in the file again with the documents. Remember how we didn't want that one because it was like a lot more.
Alright.
Now there's only four.
Actually, that one was more easy as compared to this.
The other two had like 16, but we only have 4 or 5.
Yeah.
So we're
But do we have one more role with us, right? Yeah, I got a mail from
Apparently.
Yeah.
It's kind of annoying.
someone who we collaborate with her as well.
I guess I should email her.
Yeah, that would be fine.
But it's kind of irritating.
Yeah, I already submitted this assignment, so no problems for this one.
I thought you said you didn't do it.
Are you talking about the assignment or the?
The assignment.
I thought you were talking about the project. Yeah, I submitted this one.
What is the rapid lock disadvantage? Can you pull it up? Download it.
I did not put the disadvantages of any. I just put the advantages of one, and like one or two disadvantages of any. I did not find that.
You didn't put it?
No.
You're supposed to put advantages and disadvantages for each type.
Yeah, right. But I did not find the disadvantages of many, so I just uploaded the advantages. So.
What about these
These
ones?
two are easy.
Did you do the quiz?
This quiz, yeah.
Remember the answers?
Actually, I remember it. I just scored, I guess, 3 or 5. I got it wrong.
Can you see if that shows you?
This quiz, I
Might
don't
not
know.
show you the question.
No, this quiz you're talking about, no. I have not submitted this one. No, not yet.
Oh, I wish, I'm gonna talk to him about giving us more time.
Yeah, but.
We had last week, we had like 5 minutes to do
Oh,
5
yeah, this is 10
questions.
minutes. The last quiz was just 5 minutes. This one is at least 10 minutes. The last one was just 5. Yeah.
I mean, I guess he doesn't.
5 minutes is very less time for. Yeah, we do not get thinking time at all. So. And about the emerging like subject, like the project 2, do we have to work in the same group or that was for the project 1 or because you had mentioned that you have to work in groups of no more than 3. Can work. So if you when you want to work individually, that will be fine as well. They are doing some work upstairs.
But no, it doesn't have to be the same.
Okay.
Afternoon.
Yeah.
Imagine all of you are incredibly disappointed we're starting late, right?
Yeah. I cried myself to sleep when I saw that.
You're not getting your money's worth, right?
You're gonna change the due date in Canvas on that assignment?
Thought I just did this morning.
I just checked a minute ago and it still showed in mine as like past due.
It's not, okay? It's due next week, and I've actually modified it slightly. We're gonna talk about it.
Okay.
But I thought I changed it.
It still says due today at 12:30 p.m.
It's not. Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. I just didn't want my group calling me later tonight freaking out.
That's a good thing, right? Terry responded pretty quickly. I got a response in 15 minutes. He is out of the norm, right?
Added.
Does that coincide with the names you have?
Yes.
Good. Good. What are their titles?
So,
Because I looked him up, he's called project engineer.
yeah, it's research engineer.
I mean,
So Priya Kamakers, he is research engineer in Georgia.
but did you know Terry's title is project or resident, it's not research engineer, I don't think. All right. Anyway, he was quick.
Yeah.
I was really lenient on this one. I gotta get rid of this. Not that y'all didn't do a really good job.
My tears.
This one of y'all? Sure, right?
We are all in the same.
Oh, you are?
Yeah.
I didn't read further on.
Oh, yeah.
Has that been going on while I've been gone?
Yeah.
Somebody's got a heel key up there, just going to town.
What's up, Shannon?
You put a grade on this one.
Yes, I love
Did I give
it.
you a grade? in-
Great
Yeah.
energy. Come on, guys. Start us off.
This ought to be fun.
Should take this guy nowhere.
They're on that corner out there.
Bring it in. Come on, don't be late. There you go.
Hannah,
Yes. Oh. Okay. There you go. How you doing? Afternoon. Fantastic.
what's wrong with her?
How you doing, Jack?
She's running for political office.
Yeah.
Primaries next week or she's actually on the ballot. So you better make sure you vote, okay?
How much did you buy?
It's like our clock's out too.
So, not a small investment.
Afternoon, gentlemen. What's your real name? Is it David? Oh. I mean, that's great. I'm just somewhat surprised, you know?
And look lot of time. People just drop it.
Yeah, yeah, right. It's like, you sure about that? Let's go ahead and get started, okay? I'm sure one of your groups here. For those of you in distance land, we started about an hour late today, so if I don't forget to tell you to jump an hour ahead in the tape, shame on me. I posted exercise 3, and Brian reminded me I didn't change the due date, so. Excuse me. It's due next week, next Tuesday. But what I changed, okay? 2 things. One, I added on Canvas, I actually added access to the Roland office building. It's a really small little office job, single story. And Anderson on Highway, I think 76 going to Anderson. It's actually in Anderson County. And I did that because I think it's more conducive for us to do some estimating on and scheduling on moving forward, okay? For this exercise, I'm not asking you to schedule construction, so, you know, it's, you know, you get a feel for what the job is, okay? Number 2, I don't want you to spend time on trying to figure out what Anderson does. So assume that this project is in the confines of Clemson. Okay, so whatever you learned today, whatever you've already found out about Clemson, you know, as far as activities, as far as what the process is, assume this job will be similar. You know, you obviously need to assume that it's already zoned commercial, so it's not gonna go through a lot of pushback from the community, all that good stuff. So it'll be somewhat of a normal job. I'm asking you also maybe to schedule stuff and actually establish durations on things you don't know. Like, I'm not sure any of you know how long it takes to get a financing commitment. Well, you haven't done it, right? But I think at this juncture, you know it's more than a day, right? Probably less than a year, correct? And I'll never, well, I should say no. I hesitate asking you to do this, okay? You can ask anybody you know. But for the 3 or 4 or 5 activities maybe you have no feel for, you can actually search to Google, which I'm sure you'll do anyway. I'm not grading durations, okay? I mean, you need to keep them reasonable. It's a small job. You know, it's not something the investment community, excuse me, I got something stuck, is gonna have to spend a lot of time looking at, okay? What else? You need to bring with you next time both your original submission, what I'm gonna grade, and a copy. Because we're gonna talk through it. I think I still have a doc cam here. I think.
There you
All right, so we're gonna take a look at some of them next time, okay? So bring me a copy we can use in class and one that you can actually refer to. All right, everybody with me? Now, the next question I have for you is, how many of you have actually developed or have some experience with scheduling software? Raise your hands high. There's 6 of you, okay? Now, is that MS Project?
Primavera.
What now?
Primavera.
Primavera.
Project
Project.
and Primavera.
Project? Well, then the next week or 2 are probably going to be kind of old hat to you, okay? Maybe I'll get you to teach. I've been told that a fair amount of you, which makes sense, is like roughly 10 out of, or 12 out of 16, 18. You don't have any experience. So I've been told that this course needs to teach you some basic scheduling stuff, which we'll do. But there's 2 components to developing a schedule. One is you got to plan the job first, and then you schedule. Schedule's putting it into some software. Software's software. It's like anything. We just got to learn it. But they all, I mean, scheduling software. Primavera has a few more bells and whistles than MS Project, but by and large, the people I'm talking to in the industry, more and more of them are moving to MS Project. It's simpler.
Yes.
And it does what they need to do. They're not using it for all these other fancy things. But if you get out of here and somebody's using Primavera, you know the capabilities. The question is learning the software. So, and you're capable of doing that. How many of you have actually been involved in development planning? When I say that means identifying the activities, determining durations, talking and establishing sequence, the detail that you put in the schedule. Raise your hands high. Talk about the schedule. Talk about the plan. All right? Explain the project and what your experience is.
So the project was building a steel mill for a hot rolling steel plates
Where?
in India.
Okay.
And we were installing machineries that would roll the mill, and when it comes out of mill, it will grind the rolling the rollers. We were putting 2 machineries, one which will transport the coil from the mill to the next station, and also we are putting another machinery that would roll the.
What was your role?
What?
What was your role?
I was the project engineer. I was overseeing the whole installment phase of it, the construction phase of it.
So you got pretty deep into the planning cycle.
Yes.
How about the rest of you? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, on a lot of our projects, what we do, my role is kind of cradle to gate type planning, you know, all the way from programming to operation. But on a construction level, I mean, we always sit down and go through the master, you know, take the divisions of work, look at those and figure out, all right, which ones are applicable to the project. And then some people call it last planner, I call it backwards planning. You start at the end, we know when we gotta have something, and then we just start working our way backwards going, all right, what do I need done before final inspection? Well then, okay, what do I need done? And start working our way back, hitting those individual trades, and then if you're able to, you can get their input. A lot of times if I'm putting together a schedule, I'm not getting in the details. I'm just telling people, I need it by this time, and then the trades, the subs, we can come together and work on the details.
some meat
of
on the
how
bone.
can you get to this? What do I need to kind of give and take to negotiate to the time when I need something done?
David, how about you? Don't have any experience planning? How about the rest of you? Who else had some? Talk about it.
So, I was working for a real estate development firm in India.
Right.
So I started as a project engineer, and my role was I was looking at a project it was a township project. It had around 12 towers, each of 30 stories. So I was looking after 2 towers, and my role was to create a procurement plan as well as construction plan, and then schedule all the activities right from excavation until closing out.
How'd it turn out?
I completed 2 buildings in a
I know you
3
completed it.
years.
Was it on time?
No, there were a lot of delays. Approval delays and all this stuff.
I got a piece of granola caught. I shouldn't have eaten before. Go ahead. Why was it behind schedule, just out of curiosity?
The first reason was an airport was coming nearby. So
Oh, so it's plane landing?
Yeah. So that
That screwed you up?
No, my job was different. My job was to I developed my plan from a site engineer perspective. We had a main schedule or master schedule. So based on that, we developed our own schedule just to make sure that we are on time. So that was one thing, and we also developed a contractor schedule. It was a little tight. So that was the
It was a little tight.
tightness. It was strictly managed, strictly monitored. The durations were constrained.
Do you think most projects are a little tight?
We have to be.
I mean, they really are, right? Generally speaking. Well, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, we did a historic synagogue, so we were.
Oh, that's interesting.
The owner, and we had a drop dead date. It was actually this past September when their high holiday started, so the synagogue had to be all put back together. So we started right there and started working back when we needed certain drawings done so we could get them out, and when certain things needed to be installed so we could hit that date. And then we also managed how they were going to get the money to do it, and when they needed to have this fund secured and all that stuff. So it was pretty complicated.
How'd it turn out?
So they had trouble. They told us they had a certain amount of money, and when it came time to it, they actually only had like half of that. So we had to go back up in VE and see what they could actually afford, but it turned out pretty good.
Was it on time?
It was.
Congrats. Working with religious groups, is that pretty common?
This is actually my only religious project, because the owner, he was a client of ours, and this was like his pet project.
I did a job for a church. Well, we did a job. Manager called me, says, I think they're running out of money. They promised us the same thing, that they had the money. I said, find out what they've got, and once we found out what they had, I says, determine how far we can go before they run out. And I says, don't forget lead times and everything else you've committed. You're gonna shut her down in time to get paid. And that was like 30 or 45 days off, maybe 60. And I went to the congregation meeting because he didn't want to be the bearer of bad tidings, which was fine. And I told him the situation, and I said, we gotta shut her down. Either come up with the funds, or we gotta stop. You know what they said? Guess what they said? You gotta keep faith, you know? We'll get it, I said, hey, that doesn't pay the bills. So it's not uncommon, an owner has impact on what you're trying to do. Dan, how about you? Who else had their hand up? That actually did a plan? Kayla?
Okay, so what I did was not in detail as everyone else, but I'm gonna go ahead and share my experience, which is like a 3-week look ahead.
I know they can't hear you on tape.
Oh,
Speak up. I mean, and we all need to remember that, okay?
so what I did was a 3-week look ahead, and that was based on project benchmarks. And so, for example,
So you did what's called a near-term schedule, a short-term schedule,
Yes.
look ahead and right.
So, I was a field engineer in the first year, and my primary responsibility was monitoring the wrapping of banquettes with wood planking. So I would have to like track how many wood planks would be installed each day, to then track how many banquettes could be completed each week, to then say, okay, the banquettes will be done in 6 weeks. So, in kind of using that as an example, there would be tasks like how many rooms can we get gypcrete by the first benchmark, which is like having the model unit turned around. Will we be able to say like, okay, the whole first floor has been poured with gypcrete, things like that. So it's not necessarily planning as detailed as everyone else's, but it's planning on like a smaller scale of, okay, here's this task, here's how much material has been installed each day, okay, using that to kind of apply that to that duration, it'll be done here.
All right, most of what you do when you get out of here, even in fast track, and I think Brian alluded to it, you may not know the 20 things or the 30 things or the 50 things a developer has to do and how they're related and whatever to get to where they're ready to release for construction, but they generally lean on you for what? What should you be good at? What skill set does a contractor normally bring to the table during the pre-development? What skill set do you have? Come on, spit it out, Root.
Construction?
I mean, we're talking about before construction even starts. What skill set do you bring to the table that an owner, if you're brought in early during the pre-construction period or the pre-development period, in other words, at the inception of the job, what can you offer? You should be very proficient at the planning and scheduling process. No different than what Brian kind of alluded to, some time frames, but now let's fill in the details here. How do you get from there to there? What do you have to do? How long does that each one take? And you've got a skill set to put that together to develop a plan. And what I'm asking you to do, frankly, on this, identifying the activities, I think hopefully from that development lecture we talked about a week or so ago, you can get a list of some activities, hopefully get some insight from Todd today. Some of them are somewhat intuitive, you may be aware of them. You don't have the skill set probably to develop durations, maybe except for design. Some of you may have a feeling how long design activities should take, but again, don't stress out over it, okay? Because not only do you're not really needed for this exercise, but that's not what I'm grading, and you probably don't need that skill set when you get out of here, unless you're going to be a developer. The only thing I would take issue with what Brian said, or I'd ask you to consider, backwards planning, which I'm not a real proponent of, because my 2 cents, the way I'm comfortable planning, I start at the beginning and I try to run a plan that I think is a reasonable plan to execute, and let it follow where it falls. And if it's not within the date, all right, what do I need to do? What do I need to do out of the ordinary to pull this thing back to what I have for time frame delivery? Now that's just the way I approach it, okay? Doesn't make one right and the other one wrong, or vice versa. It's just that I think when you're looking at a developer, with construction, it's often a function of resources. I may think it's reasonable to put brick in 2 months based on a crude size that I think is reasonable for the area. And when I get all said and done with a plan, it may need to be done in 6 weeks. Hey, I got to get a bigger crew. Much of what the developer goes through up front, they don't really control a lot. They influence it, they don't control it. They don't control when they get commitment from an investor. If that's a key element on their schedule and they can't really move forward without it, they may have an idea, but they can't throw more resources at it. My point is, I think if you were sitting down with a developer, they often have an end date in mind, and what you bring to the table would be, okay, here's a reasonable construction time. The problem they have, in my opinion, what I've seen is what happens beforehand is tough. Just because they say commitment has to be by X date, doesn't mean you're gonna get it. It doesn't mean that the city's gonna approve it by X date. That may be reasonable, that may be good for planning purposes. You can't, it's tough to overcome slippage. I mean, it's tough to overcome slippage in construction. But in theory, you put more resources on it and you can overcome it, right? I don't think that same philosophy works up front now, except for maybe design activities. But even there, I mean, you're a designer. It's pretty tough to compress that activity because it's not somebody sitting down in front of a computer and doing a design. They're not working with a visor on their head, shutting out the world. They're doing it in a very collaborative effort with a lot of people. And to take it and compress it is difficult. I'm not saying it can't be done, it's just tough. And you may sacrifice completeness, you may sacrifice creativity, you know, you may be, and that's pretty offensive to a lot of people, and also if you're an owner, it may not be the best choice. Because you're talking about what, a building's design that you gotta live with for 30, 40 years. I'm not trying to make excuses for developers, I'm suggesting to you, we're gonna lay out a plan for it, you're gonna use your best judgment, and you'll probably do that when you help them develop, but I would encourage you as practitioners to help them build in reasonable contingency, because, I mean, right now Clemson's opening the business school, actually a year late. A 3-year job or 2-year job that's a year late. That's a 50% overrun. It's not a big thing for them. Why? Because they can just extend it to the next semester. If you were renting out to an office tenant, you just lost the lease. I mean, it's a big deal. Anyway, all I'm trying to tell you is be sensitive to that, all right? Which I think is, you know, hopefully something Todd will touch on. When he comes here at 2, and hopefully he'll be here close to on time, he's got another engagement at 3:30, so he wanted to push back his start date to 2. When I say a commitment, he's got another commitment at Martin Hall, so he's going to be on campus anyway. But anyway, I would encourage you to probe him after, you know, I asked him first to talk about Clemson's process. Because I'm not saying Clemson's normal, but it is what, Midtown, it's a small town USA. I think you could probably make an argument that when you go to larger metropolitan areas, it's more of a detailed process, but I'd also make an argument it's probably more sophisticated management of it too. So, and maybe more support for somebody who want to make it, but that's me. But I think I think the steps are very simple, regardless if it's a small city or a large city. You still have people interested in it. You still have zoning and ordinances and all the stuff you got to deal with. A lot of the elements you're going to have here, I think you'll see in Greenville. So I would encourage you to try to pull that out so that you're aware of those things. Okay. As far as time frame and durations, you know, if time's there as you're talking through it, feel free to ask him those questions. You know, how long should this take? You know, if he sits there and tells you this job took 2 years to go through, what's normal? And you probably say, well, there is no such thing as normal. But what would it be prudent to assume at the start of this process? Yes, go ahead, Rick.
So,
Thank you for being so patient.
let's say I am a developer. I secured a lease agreement with some commercial farm, and like this mixed-use development, my development is getting delayed because of regulatory approvals. I mean, it's no wonder that the construction is also getting delayed. So, what's the implication? Am I going
What
to
recourse do you have? Tell me, what are you asking?
Yeah. So, is it like I'm going to lose that lease contract?
Depends on what your lease said. And I realize, again, it depends on size. I mean, if you're going to do an office building in this country, 20, 30 years ago, it was not uncommon to do 100% spec, do it without any firm tenants. That's pretty rare now, which means you've got anchor tenants. There's a certain amount of what they call pre-leasing before a bank will commit.
Yes.
Fortunately, by that time, most of that pre-development's done, but a lot of these projects are phased. You know, foundations, they're fast-tracked, so they're not getting approval for the whole thing, they're getting approval for pieces.
Right.
Now, in theory, it's probably through the overall approval process, but there's still interaction with the city. If it doesn't come down and the city is the reason for a holdup or approval, they're the government. If you lose your tenant because of the city or the contractor, I mean, you could try to sue the contractor, but they probably got reasons too, but suing the city, good luck. It's like suing yourself. So, I mean, if you're a developer, I think the real risk for you, in my opinion, and it'd be great to ask, is what you have to come off on the cuff, what you've got to invest in this deal before it gets to a stage where you're ready to pull the trigger and, you know, buy the land or whatever. And sometimes you got to reach out to investors. You don't have enough funds. And to do that, you're making commitments, right? How secure those commitments are. In other words, what collateral, you know, just on your word. And it could put you in a precarious situation. But again, that'd be a great question to ask them. You know, we traditionally don't have to deal with it. All I'm suggesting to you, part of your job, especially if you're fast tracking, is you need to be empathetic to what they're going through, what they have gone through, what they're going through now, and what they need in order to open the door. And the more you're aware of what they have to go through, I think the more understanding, more empathetic, the more you're in a position to help. Whether it's, you know, hey, you know, we really need this, or, I mean, you help guide them to a successful closure. If that makes any sense to them. Okay? So anyway, pick his brain. I've asked him to, and if you would, let him finish the normal process. I hope that's his approach before you really dive into it, because I think it would be great for him to share with you what happened on that job. You know, what truly was, in retrospect, if it could have been done again, what could have that developer done? What could have been done to take that 2-year process or 2.5 or 3-year process and condense it to what normally is the case? And you might even, I mean, I think certainly an open question if we have time is, where's Clemson head? You know, development isn't stopping with this job. And he's going to show you that it does. You know, what's the future look like for how these projects are brought online? And again, you know my guess. I haven't talked to him, but I think that whole area is going to be rezoned. And 10 years from now, there'll be whatever. I mean, Greenville just went through a variance on one of the major projects under consideration. Anybody following the news? Y'all need to start reading stuff besides Facebook, okay?
We're reading qualitative methods, Dr. Boston.
What?
We're reading qualitative methods. Things.
I'm supposed to do what?
Qualitative methods. That's what we're reading.
Hey, see that? You know what that is, right? Now, Greenville just, I forget the project name, it's the next major development. They're redeveloping where the city offices used to be, and I don't know where that exactly is in downtown Greenville or near downtown Greenville. But apparently they've sold that off to development or something. Anyway, they've now relaxed the height restriction from 6-story, they've raised it to 12. That's not on downtown. So what do you think's next for downtown? Downtown, I think, is at 10 right now, plus or minus. I think it's going to be here in 5-10 years. And the projects that are gonna bear the brunt of changing that are what? The one, I mean, part of what I think may have caused this one some challenge, there, and I don't wanna waste time talking to Todd, about it, but I think they started breaching, into the high-rise code, which means now wood and some of the materials now are a little bit, you gotta get variances for it. And I'm sure that complicated even further. My point is, when you have a development that's pushing the envelope, it does what to pre-development timeframe? Probably extend. If you're fitting underneath the umbrella of what's up, somebody's already done. Rock and roll, right? Because once you let somebody do it, once they let that project now in Greenville that's not downtown do 12 stories, what do you think that's telling everybody else with a piece of property in the general vicinity? With similar zoning. And how did they tell them no? I told somebody and I'm not Nostradamus, okay? But I told them 5 or 6 years ago when Campus View went in, I says, that's cast the future of downtown Clemson. Everybody's complaining back then that we're losing the small town feel. And this was what? A 4-story set on a hill. So it effectively looks like a 6 or 8 story, right? Looming over downtown. I says, dang, it's coming. And now over the last 4, 5, 6 years, it's traveling up everywhere, 4 and 5 story. I wouldn't be surprised that even downtown, you start getting variances. Footages and heights. It's just the way it happens. Doesn't make it right or wrong, just how it is, okay? I'm not sitting here trying to be anti-development. But I am suggesting to you again, when you push the envelope on anything, you tend to what? Interject a few challenges. Whether it be construction, trying to, tack the envelope on time, or a developer trying to do something new. Or a designer wanting to, develop a new concept. All that stuff takes time to convince people that, hey, you need to buy in. All right, any questions before we move forward? What I'm gonna do, I sent you, go ahead, Nathan.
I was just wondering with the Microsoft.
With what?
With the Microsoft project stuff, do you know if we can get that on Mac? Or do you know?
I didn't know, you gotta do a divider, right? They only have Microsoft for Windows, or Project for Windows, my knowledge. You gotta do a
Partition or something.
yeah, whatever it's called. And I don't know how to do that, man, but you might call help, okay? But since he's brought it up, I sent you, it used to be I just had to send them your little ID, and they'd send you an invite to access project. It's called Project 2016, not MS Project, if you go to the software listing. I sent you the instructions that they provided me. Hopefully they work. You need to load this software up before next time. Bring your laptop, because we're going to start messing with it, okay? So load it. If anybody has a problem loading it, call the help desk, okay? And I'm not trying to push you out, but I'm not attacking you, all right? I've got mine loaded, and I didn't have a problem with it, but invariably, somebody will have a problem, okay? And that's what the help desk is there for, okay? So load it up. We're gonna take a little time next time to talk about activities and durations and relationships and what y'all are coming up with. Moving forward, what we're gonna do next time, starting next week, we're gonna talk about that first and try to get some meeting of the minds and discussion of the relationship with these activities, which hopefully will help you with your project. The next step is I wanted to talk to you briefly about some what I call scheduling fundamentals. And then the following week, I'm going to give you back the activities and the durations that we'll all use. And eventually, we're going to be putting the same thing, all of us, the same thing in MS Project. So all you're doing is learning the software if you don't already know it. And it's, for those of you that don't know it, within one period, I think you'll be proficient. I've also posted online, and I think it's available already, I call it MS Project 2016 for Dummies, and I'm a dummy, okay? But it's a 3 or 4 page, how, step by step, here's what you do. When you pull it up, it's not time dated in this sense. When I developed that logic for that program, it was 2018. So the first instruction or two has 2018 dates. You all need to ignore that, okay? But short of that, the rest, 2016 hasn't changed since it's been published. So the instructions are still relevant, all right? That'll get us next week and the following week, and I think after that, shortly thereafter, we have a midterm. So we're pushing through it. Again, I don't see any problem getting through it because I think most of you have some feel for scheduling. If I don't dig deep enough next week on the fundamentals, grab me and I'll try to maybe fill you all in one-on-one. It's pretty basic. From a contractor standpoint, most of the relationships, there's I don't know what percentage, 70, 80% of the relationships, maybe 60, I don't know, are what you call physical relationships. And you can't hang drywall until the studs are up. There's certain things you just can't do. They're physically related. So once you know materials and methods, or have a grasp of that, a lot of that stuff falls into place. Now, some of the relationships start with the stuff that we'll talk about gets a little bit more nuanced, and then the interrelationship with different disciplines is a little bit more related to what kind of a body of knowledge you have. That's not the intent of this course, okay? What I've done with this project is I've not given you a lot of detail. One of the reasons is why. You don't have a lot of drawings. Come on in, young man. Welcome, Todd.
Took a while to find a parking space.
Yeah, I could have told you that. In fact, I think I did.
left at 1:30 and just took a little bit longer than I thought.
This is Todd Stedman. He is Director of Planning and Codes for Clemson as a city, and I think you've been in that position for what?
About 5 years.
Yeah, he's like the man with all the answers, and he's been gracious with his time over the years. I saw another article on Clemson that I looked up, and the planning students came down there and took up some of your time over the last.
Yeah.
So and I think he's a former instructor at Clemson, right? Former professor at Clemson.
Yeah, I taught professional ethics for the landscape architecture graduate and undergraduate program.
So anyway, if I can find Planning 101, where was that again?
On the far side.
Is it on the far side? Yeah, there you go. I'm going to turn it over to you. Todd, I've got a little controller. You might be able to utilize that.
It'd be great. We'll give it a shot.
And what you need to bear in mind, there's only a single camera. It doesn't move.
Okay.
So if you get past here, you're off camera. And
If
number
I stay
two,
back there, I'm good?
yeah, and that also is the best place to pick up voice, okay? Let me get you set up. Hold on.
How do I get over to slide?
I'll get you
Yeah,
there. I'll get
my
you there.
slideshow started. There at the top. Okay. Actually, if you can go back one slide, I think there's a. See if I can do it.
Oh, what am
There
I
you go.
doing? Yeah, it's right up here. All right, it's all yours. You get out of your way.
So let me tell you what I'm planning to talk about, and I'm hoping to leave time for questions and answers in case what I have to share with you is not what you really hope to learn. But Dennis had suggested that I talk a little bit about the process of planning and zoning, because no matter what you do, if you're out there as a builder, sooner or later you're going to be bumping up to a municipality, and the way that they do things is critical, and it can make or break your project. It can save you time and money, and it can cost you time and money if you don't do it. My experience from having been on both sides of this, I first began working with building codes and zoning ordinances as a developer and as a landscape architect consultant, and I ran into various degrees of support at different municipalities. Some people were great and would walk you through it, and others just said, "You figure it out, dude, I don't have time." And I think generally most municipalities recognize that these rules can be fairly complex. And as such, they're patient and understanding and willing to take the time to help guide you through it. But it is really important that for any project that you're doing, that you're aware of what these overarching guidelines and laws and rules are. It can make a huge difference. And that's part of what I want to go through. And then I want to use a couple of case studies of how the project changed and morphed because of changes in code and because of actions the developer did and did not take in that process. So hopefully that'll give you an overview and then leave time for questions and answers. I'll be happy to help you in any way I can. And if we run out of time and I forget to say it, Dennis knows how to contact me. I'm easily found at the city, and that if you have questions throughout the rest of your academic career or after you get out of here, and you're wondering where to start on something, please don't hesitate to call. I'll be happy to guide you through it. I found that the planning and zoning community generally is very open and cooperative and willing to share. You know, our goal is to help you succeed, and that we're here to administer these laws, and we recognize they can be complex, and you shouldn't feel awkward going, I'm not getting this, or I need some help guiding through it. So put us to use. So with zoning, this is the map of Clemson, the big white egg, that's the university, and that's our city limits. And so every parcel of land in the city has been given a very specific zoning designation. And with that zoning designation, those are that points you to all the guidelines of what can and cannot happen there and the specifics of what can happen on every parcel of land. It is highly prescriptive, that there's very little room for interpretation for these things. There are a couple things that can be interpreted, but generally speaking, from a zoning standpoint, you prefer it to be spelled out. Otherwise, every case we're having to debate and discuss and argue and make a decision, and might make a decision for you one way and then you another way. It complicates things. So generally, it's very prescriptive. It's yes or no. It can be this height, period. And that's how it's set up. So this is where it all starts, is with the map. And there are a lot of decisions that go into determining why a piece of land is zoned the way it is. And we can talk about that at a later date. But just to start with, every parcel of land in the city has been given a zoning designation. In this case, most of the yellow and tans are residential, and then you get in the darker colors, the translation of colors of this is a little funky, and it might have been what I sent to Mr. Bousman, but usually it's the reds along our corridors and in our core areas. That's our commercial districts. But you know, we're 85% residential. But I want to talk a little bit about the hierarchy of planning and zoning. And in most states, it starts with what's called an enabling act. In South Carolina, they passed this in 1994. And what this says is that if a county or a municipality is going to have zoning, that they have to follow certain guidelines. So at the state level, they created an overarching set of basic rules that said, here's how we're going to do planning in the state of South Carolina. Here's how we're going to do zoning in the state of South Carolina. They're broad-reaching guidelines, but they are absolute. They intentionally built in flexibility, recognizing that no one's going to know better for their community than that community. So they're not as prescriptive about, can you have a gas station here, or how tall can your buildings be? They say, these are the rules you're going to follow to make those decisions. So that's what the Enabling Act does. And so whatever state you end up in, familiarizing yourself with this document is a good first step. And one of the things that the Enabling Act requires in South Carolina is that if you're going to have zoning, Every 10 years, you have to do a comprehensive plan. And this requires that you look at transportation, housing, population, natural resources, cultural resources, community resources, recreation, and in Clemson we added another layer, and we called it town and gown, because the relationship between our community and the university is so interwoven and symbiotic that we felt like it deserved its complete set of guidelines. And so in a comprehensive plan, you have to establish strategies and goals and objectives. What is it that you're setting out to do? The state doesn't tell you what those have to be. The state tells you you have to have a plan. And so we have a comprehensive plan that you have to adopt every 10 years, and every 5 years you have to review it. We just finished our 5-year update of that plan. Then the next step of the layer, now the comprehensive plan is not a enforceable document. The Enabling Act, those are laws. The land development regulations, which are kind of the next step in the process, and that deals with roadways and infrastructure. How are you going to, what your roadway profiles are going to be, what types of connectivity, how many feet is a block, stormwater management, how the process for subdividing land, and that's whether you're taking one parcel and dividing into two, or creating kind of a traditional subdivision where you got 100 acres and you want to build 75 homes. Those are all handled in the land development regulations. That is an enforceable document. You can only do what that allows, and that tells you what is allowed. You'll find this in almost every community. They may call it something different, but they'll have a set of land development regulations. And that is an enforceable document. So you start with this Enabling Act from the state, which basically says, okay, you can have planning and you can have zoning, but here's some general guidelines that everybody's going to follow. Comprehensive plan is a little more, well, a lot more specific to the community, but it's more of a set of guiding principles. It's, I don't want to say it's just a wish list, but it is a wish list, and that is up to the municipality to decide whether or not to enact on the comp plan. You have to have the plan, and it's a basic rule of the Enabling Act. And then the next layer where you start really getting into specifics of the land development regulations. Clemson just updated ours a year ago. They had not been touched in 18 years. There were a couple modifications in there, but it was time, and that we introduced 2 whole new sections this time. One is about the tree canopy. This is where, under land development regulations, that we're striving for a certain percentage of tree canopy in our community, and that we have guidelines about the impact of what happens if you remove trees, that you have to plant back a certain number of trees. All that is codified in the land development regulations. And also there, for the first time, we put in language about dealing with steep slopes, because a lot of people were just coming in and just flat topping a piece of land, and that was creating some stormwater issues. And we provided guidelines about how to develop using the contours of the land. And that was very contentious. It was believed by many to feel like it was not developer friendly. It does create additional cost and challenges. And there was a lot of discussion about that, and we staff and the planning commission who proposed it, we didn't get everything we wanted, but we've advanced that. We've taken positive steps to try to recognize that we live in a hilly area, and that there are impacts to coming in and just leveling an area. Over behind Publix, for example, I think there's like a 60-foot retaining wall, straight retaining wall. We're trying to avoid that kind of thing because in part it does create a lot of stormwater velocity issues, and then there's an aesthetic and a missed opportunity for creating terracing where we can introduce more tree canopy. But all that kind of stuff is handled in your land development regulations. And then the next layer is the zoning ordinance and the zoning map. The zoning ordinance is about a 500-page document that is very specific. It tells you all your setbacks, how far from the property lines your building face can be, the height, what uses are allowed, how many parking spaces, what size the parking spaces have to be, drive lane widths. If it's a commercial property, what kind of landscaping you have to have in the parking lot, buffers between uses. If you're putting a school in a neighborhood, how far away do you have to, what kind of buffer do you have to leave to protect the neighborhood? Signage, there's a lot in there about signage. Parking signage, buffer yards, commercial, residential. It talks about appeals, how if a person disagrees with the code or with a decision that comes out of our camp, what are their rights? How can they challenge this? We have a whole set of standards on lighting, very specific guidelines about the heights of fixtures and the lumens of fixtures and how you measure that, and the guidelines associated with getting a lighting plan approved. So it's super specific. And it evolves constantly, in part because the community is evolving, and standards that we put in place 2 years ago that get reevaluated. The circumstance may arise to say, we've been trying to use this code and it really doesn't do what we want it to do, so we go in and amend the code. Over the last year, because our planning commission has been working with the comprehensive plan, that we built up a backlog of about 75 changes to our zoning ordinance that normally we would have trickled through, but because they were in over their heads trying to get this comprehensive plan done, that it piled up. And last night was the first night we're starting to slowly, in chunks of like 10 or 15 of these ordinance changes, begin to address them. Some of them are just clarifications that we talk about mixed-use buildings, which is obviously like commercial on the ground floor, residential above, but we don't talk about mixed-use developments where you have a parcel of land and you have commercial and residential but separate buildings. Ranges from things like that, which are fairly substantive, to the fact that more and more of these high-density student housing projects are providing lawn areas for dogs, or in some cases no lawn areas for dogs, and we've had an increased problem with dogs pooping on sidewalks into people's yards, and so we're addressing that if you're going to allow pets, that we're going to require you have a pet curbing area and the doggy bag, the poop bag stations, and these are things that weren't an issue before because these large high-density developments are relatively new to Clemson. And so as problems manifest themselves, the zoning ordinance is fluid, which makes it even harder for people to think they understand it, including staff, that you get accustomed to the way the code is, but it's constantly changing. And so that's why befriending somebody in your zoning and codes department should be a real asset to you as you go through your career, because hopefully they can help guide you. And often in the zoning ordinance it might say one thing in one place, but then a slightly different version of it exists in another chapter. Sometimes that's intentional, sometimes they're not contradictory but just appear to be, and sometimes they are contradictory. That's another thing we're cleaning up. We've identified places where it says this here, says something else elsewhere, and we're cleaning that up. And sometimes we don't have that choice to where we got a contradiction. There's a developer in front of us that says, you got to make a decision. And generally, and what's supported by the Enabling Act, is that whenever you have a contradiction in your ordinance, that the more restrictive applies. And again, I've had to interpret, well, which one is more restrictive? And some people have disagreed with my decision, and some have. But it's a fluid, complex document, and that often a change in one section has a ripple effect throughout the whole document. But it's a good thing to know. Ours is on the website. We have an interactive version of it. We switched over to a new company called Encode 360, and we think it's a lot more user-friendly than it used to be. It's a lot more searchable. That we have a lot of hot links in there that'll take you to images, to give you examples, and to provide definitions and things like that. Even then, you should not feel inadequate or like you were poorly taught if when you're plowing your way through it, you're scratching your head going, I'm having trouble with this. It is A-okay and understandable, and you should reach out to help to make sure you understand it, because you're expected to. And that if you don't, despite best efforts on the staff or yourself, that if you don't do something per code, and it's discovered in the process, you will have to come back and fix it. And that's where time and money come into play. So then, the next level are our boards and our bylaws. I just mentioned our planning commission, that in Clemson and in the state of South Carolina, that any change to an ordinance first has to go to the planning commission. They make an assessment, and they make a recommendation to city council. The planning commission does not have authority but to do two things. They name streets. Odd, that's one of the powers they have. And that they also approve subdivisions. And again, by subdivisions, in Clemson, we have created 3 subdivisions: simple, minor, and major. Simple subdivision is if a person has 2 acres and they want to create 3 lots on it. That's a simple one. That's done at the staff level. If it's more than 3 and less than 10, then that's a minor subdivision. That has to go to the planning commission. If it's over 10, it's a major subdivision. And both a minor and a major have pages of guidelines associated with what has to occur prior to making that decision. The planning commission has authority over that. They're the final say for minor and major subdivisions. But they are an advisory board. So they make a recommendation to council. Council, the first thing they do is they have a public hearing, and then that way the entire community, anyone with a vested interest, can come out and weigh in on it and say they like the idea or they don't like the idea, or make recommendations to modify it. And then subsequent to that, council has 2 votes, and then it becomes the new law. So that's one of the boards that we have. And then each board is governed by their bylaws. The planning commission is required to have public input. You can come to any planning commission meeting and whatever issue they're discussing that day. As a citizen, you have the right to speak up. They'll call on you, and you have a right to have your opinions heard. And then they cut off public input, and then they deliberate and make a decision. Clemson, unlike most small towns, but like most major cities, also has an architectural overlay district. We have 9 of them actually, and that I keep thinking there's a map up there, but all of our major corridors, Highway 76, 123, 93, downtown, from the Esso Club up to the Palmetto Smokehouse, an area out by Columbo's Pizza, and up under the underpass, kind of near where Calhoun Corners and the old Calhoun town is. Those are all designated as architectural districts. And what that introduces is an additional layer of approval. So any work that takes place in any of those zones, that prior to them being able to submit for a building permit, they have to go before the Board of Architectural Review. They evaluate it based on the standards that the city has developed and make a determination that those standards have been met. And once those standards have been met, then the developer is free to begin doing the engineering drawings, architectural drawings, and submit to the city. But we cannot accept building plans that have not been approved by the BAR if they're in one of those districts. Now, the BAR is actually a quasi-judicial body. They make final decisions. They can say yes or no. That doesn't go to city council. That decision rests with them. And there's a very specific list of things that they can review. They can review the building materials, the fenestration, the roof line, the architecture, the colors, the lighting scheme, the landscaping plan, the circulation plan, signage. All those things are in their purview. On the other hand, they cannot say, well, we think this is not a good use for that land. They don't have that right. That's the zoning map. Or they can't say, well, we think it's too tall. They don't have the right to set height. That's done by the district standards in the zoning ordinance. Building setbacks, that's up to the zoning ordinance. The number of parking spaces, they don't control. Buffer yards, they don't control. And so in a way of looking at it, the factors that create the building envelope are determined and granted by right in the zoning ordinance and the zoning map. And I don't want to downplay the role of the BAR, the Board of Architectural Review, but one way of looking at it is the zoning ordinance creates the building envelope, the box, and the BAR decides what that's going to look like, which is really important. If you drive through Clemson and then drive through Seneca or Easley, regardless of how you feel about some of the architecture, that there's a noticeable difference, a lot of it through the signage and the colors, and that there are the buildings downtown that we've intentionally kept them brick, where we intentionally kept the same ratio of glass as the old downtown, at least on the core downtown area. And this is by design. This is intentional. All signs have to be approved by the BAR if they're downtown. We don't allow neon or digital signs because we don't feel like that's in keeping with our community. And it's the hard work and seemingly small effort on the part of the Board of Architectural Review that has really manifested over the last decade into what our community looks like. If you ever shop at Ingalls, for example, that was built before we had our architectural district standards. And then think of like the Publix parking lot. I stay in touch with the property owners to make sure I'm learning along the way. In Publix, McAllister's, Redbox, all those places, they don't get complaints about not finding parking. But there's certainly not an excess of it there. Whereas you got the Ingalls, and I've counted 250 excess parking spaces they could eliminate. And we've talked to them about doing some park and ride stuff with CAT and things like that. But that's an example, a pretty accessible example of what Clemson looked like before we started having these standards and what it looks like now. So that's the Board of Architectural Review. And then I mentioned earlier that one of the sections of the comprehensive plan of the zoning ordinance is appeals, because nobody's perfect and everybody has a right to challenge a decision, and that's what the Board of Zoning Appeals does. If you feel like that the city, in particular me or my department, has made a decision that you want to challenge, we have a mechanism. We have a body of men and women that you can go before, and it's like a trial, that they listen to the staff's position, they listen to the citizens' position, they can hear expert witnesses, and then they make a decision one way or the other. In addition, there are times where a person simply wants to see, I know what the rules say, but is there any way that I can get around them? Or is there any way that for example, maybe we require a 25-foot setback from a house, from the street, which we do for residential properties. And maybe because of the lay of the land, they've either got some massive boulder or they've got some 100-year-old red oak in there, and they're asking for forgiveness. They're saying, can you possibly make an exception in this case because I have extenuating circumstances? And usually those extenuating circumstances relate to terrain or some natural feature. There might be a wetland or something like there that says, I'd be willing to do it, but we'd lose this wetland. And so they can appeal to the Board of Zoning Appeals and ask them, can you cut me some slack? Is there a way that you can do this differently? One of the things that you cannot say is that, well, it's cheaper, or I can get a bigger house, or it's going to save me money. Those are not considerations for the Board of Zoning Appeal. There needs to be some specific situation, and it is good and appropriate to have that option, because there are weird circumstances that come up that you need to have an avenue to address. And that's what the Board of Zoning Appeals does. And their decisions are quasi-judicial, as in they're final. If you don't like what you hear from them, it goes to court. If you don't like what you hear from the Board of Architectural Review, it goes to court, 13th Circuit Court. So that in an overview is sort of how we operate. We've got the State Level Enabling Act, which is legislative, and those are laws. You have the Comprehensive Plan, which is a set of guiding principles and goals and objectives, but it's not enforceable. For example, we had in our comprehensive plan to have a complete network of bike trails in the city. Well, we don't have them, and we're working towards them. They have a requirement in there that that all residential properties handle their stormwater on site. It's a great goal, but we haven't made that a requirement in our land development regs. Until it goes from here to one of these, it's not enforceable. It's not a law. This is very important because this is your vision statement. These are your guiding principles for your community, but they don't get teeth until they become a land development regulation or a zoning ordinance. And I explained a little bit about how those work and how intricate those can be. And then the boards and the bylaws by which they abide are a front line for administering a lot of these codes. I would say that 90+% of what happens in the city never goes to a board or a commission that is handled at the staff level. That we know somebody comes in, we can pull out our books, and they submit a plan, and we go through a long list of things, check the box. You're the right distance, you're the right height, you have the right number of parking spaces, everything is there. If you think about it, that it would jack the cost up through the roof if every one of these had to go through some kind of outside approval or had to be interpreted, because the amount of staff time and the amount of volunteer time to approve every home or every building would be time and cost prohibitive. So most municipalities rely upon a very transparent and inclusive process to create rules and laws and then grant the staff the authority to implement them. And then have a vehicle to where if somebody says, I think you goofed up, I'm not agreeing with how you interpreted the law, there's a chance for them to have their day in court, so to speak. And in my time here that I haven't had one variance granted because mostly they didn't qualify for it. And part of my job is when somebody comes is to say, I will guide you through the process and I will help you go through this process. However, I also feel like it's my job to say you're not going to get it because you don't meet the qualifications. Explain that to them. And 90% of the time, people understand that they're going, darn, but they appreciate not wasting their time and money doing it. And every once in a while, somebody says, I'm going to go for it anyway, but that generally speaking, that they don't meet the guidelines. There are 5 specific guidelines set by the state. And if they don't meet the guidelines, they don't get it. And so the board, other than architectural review, most things just come straight through the city. And that's called straight zoning. And that's the fastest, easiest way. There are no votes, there's no public input. Developers tend to like it because it takes the emotionality out of it. Especially in a community like Clemson right now where there's a lot of growing pains and there's a lot of pressure on certain areas and a lot of citizens who are very frustrated and concerned about what's happening, and that generally if you are building anything other than a single family home, and certainly student family housing, there'll be 75 people there wanting to ban the projects, and they're very frustrated. And that's a difficult thing for developers to go through because it's hard as human beings, as those boards are up there, to not be influenced by their friends and neighbors that they're looking at and to remain unbiased. It's a difficult task, and we're very fortunate for the men and women who serve on those boards because they do a really good job of being unbiased. So I'm kind of going to be a little bit redundant here. So the Board of Zoning Appeals, that's quasi-judicial. They're really supposed to just listen to the facts. It's either have you met this criteria or not. An example of that, there's a nonprofit organization in the region called Helping Hands, and that what that is that if an adult gets arrested and he has a child at home and that child doesn't have someplace else to go, Helping Hands takes them in, and that through no fault of that child, they are now in kind of foster care, if you will, while their parents are in prison. And that is a wonderful organization, and they really do some good work. Be cautious ever volunteering there because you'll come out of it kind of like wanting to adopt all these kids because they're sweet and they've done nothing wrong in life, but they're in this weird, hard situation. But you can't stay there after you turn 18. It's there to help them get them through high school. And we had a group, we had a weird circumstance where we had 4 young women who were getting ready to graduate from high school, and one of them was coming to Clemson, one was going to Southern Wesleyan, and 2 were going to Tri-County Tech. But they really weren't ready to live on their own yet, and they just weren't ready for that because they come from very difficult backgrounds, and they had they were buying a home, and we're going to have a couple who was going to live there and serve as a transition for these 4 young women to get on their feet for the first year, and then probably after that some more young people move in there. It was not co-ed, there's not going to be any, it was all single sex, and that is allowed in Clemson, but it's required to have approval from the zoning board because it's what's called special exception. And so they brought it before the Board of Zoning Appeals, and the residents came out and were vehemently opposed to it. That they said that this was, they didn't want, this was gonna be prostitution and crack dealing, and they totally misunderstood. They just had an impression of this as some kind of halfway home, or I don't know what. But it was not a proud day for our community. But fact-based conclusions and impartial judges, that the BZA listened to the facts and they ruled to allow it, which was, I think, difficult because, again, you're looking at people you know, you run into the grocery store or your church or wherever. It takes courage and conviction to make those decisions. And as a side note, the director of the Helping Hands said she was not going to put her kids in that neighborhood because if those neighbors were willing to act that way in public, then heaven knows what would happen if they actually lived there and they found another location. Board of Architectural Review, again, quasi-judicial. Their decisions are appealed by the circuit court. They seek professional advice. We have implemented something in Clemson that in a lot of communities, especially larger communities, because a lot of small communities don't have a BAR, we've been positively influenced by the university and the fact that we have a planning and an architecture department. There's a lot of knowledge and enlightenment on the part of city planning and the ways things could be done, and that we're far more advanced than most small communities. But it's also very difficult to get architects to agree to be on the board. You have to be a resident of Clemson. And you take a lot of heat because often you're making decisions about stuff that everybody's mad at you about. And so we've had a very difficult time getting architects that live in Clemson to serve on there. We currently have 2, which is great, and a landscape architect. But we had a period where there were no architects on the Architectural Review Board. Some really bright men and women, but we implemented something that's a consulting architect group to where every project we send out to 2 architects and they're getting they give their comments. So we're ensured that no matter who's on the board, that every project is going to be reviewed by some architects. And our staff, we have a lot of professional training in architectural and landscape architectural training. So we provide advice to that board about what to do, and they make informed decisions, and they're bound by code for basic standards, but they have a lot of latitude regarding aesthetics. That goes back to, they can't really control the box, the building envelope, but they can control a lot more about how it looks. And then the Planning Commission, again, they're advisory other than street names. They're supposed to be more balanced. They do listen to public input. They're trying to make recommendations that they truly believe are in the best interest of the community, even if it's not the most popular decision. And they also are involved in the ongoing planning. In our world, there's short-term planning, which is like the project I'm getting ready to show you, where somebody's coming to us for a planned development or a specific project. That's project specific, and we're going through getting that project through our ordinance. And then the ongoing planning is, where do we want to be in 5 years? Where do we want to be in 25 years? And that's the role of the Planning Commission. And then you have City Council. Now, those other boards, they're all appointed. Oh my goodness, 10 minutes. They're elected.
No,
They're
20.
20. Oh, well, you were just flashing there. I just saw. So 20's good. I can do. But they make most of the final decisions. They ultimately decide what's going to be in the code, and then the Board of Architectural Review and the BZA applies that code. So at the end of the day, the council makes the biggest decisions. They're the ones that says this is what we're going to do. And then from there it goes to courts. I've been involved in a couple of lawsuits since I've been here that we were exonerated in all of them. It was angry citizens that were just very upset with that something was allowed to go forward. And what we've discovered, and you will find too, is that as long as the city is following the rules, if they have followed their own guidelines of the Enabling Act, if they're following their own zoning ordinance, the circuit court is really hesitant to get involved to say, we know what's best. They're not gonna overrule a decision. They're gonna verify, did you post this properly? Did you do everything legal? Did you, was there any illegal communication or collusion? As long as you were playing it clean and following the rules, rarely will a court overturn your decisions. And that's been our case, is that they're going, y'all follow the rules, the chips fell where they may. Where communities have gotten in trouble is they didn't follow the rules, they didn't advertise a meeting, or that they didn't instruct one of the boards by a specific guideline that they were supposed to follow, and that's where you tend to get yourselves in trouble. So you try to stay out of court as best you can, but you know, we've never sued anybody, but they tend to sue the city. So the purpose of zoning is to implement plans and policies. Everything should be about the public interest and to the safety, health, and welfare of the community. And we're also there to protect public and private investment. Mostly what we hear at our town hall meetings are angry private property owner citizens, and that it's difficult to help them, remind them that we also have property owners that own commercial property, and it's part of our job to protect them also. It's a balancing act, and we don't believe you have to choose, that you can do both. And the same with land regs. It's more to ensure safety, convenience, circulation, more the infrastructure of how the basic 30,000 foot level of the city will be developed. And throughout the whole process, that there should be a public purpose and benefit behind every code and every decision. And the reason this is important is that the current population of the upstate is 1.4 million. And we're expecting to add an additional 350,000 over the next 20 years. Yes, ma'am?
Is that to upstate?
Yeah.
350,000, or is that just Clemson?
Upstate.
Okay.
Yeah. Clemson's residential population is about 10,000, and right now there are 26,785 students enrolled. At least that's what the Vice President of Student Affairs told me last week. I know that's our population. Now the census will read like 16,000, but that counts, that's because when they go around they count students also. We've been able to extrapolate from that, and y'all are our residents too. But year-round, full-time, non-student residents is about 10,000. We're 7 square miles, 350,000, we'd be about 40-foot stories everywhere. But this is not so staggering when you look at that number. What starts to really get to you is that we currently have 725 square miles of land in the upstate. And the upstate is a 10-county region: Greenville, Oconee, Pickens, Anderson, Spartanburg, Abbeville, that area. We currently have 725. If we follow the same current trends of development, which is largely sprawl, then by 2040 we will develop an additional 800 square miles over the next 20 years, which means that if we don't do something different, then over the next 20 years we will develop more land than we have since the beginning of time. And that's why comprehensive planning and coming up with guidelines that allow for density where it's appropriate, and to protect existing neighborhoods, and to work with our surrounding communities. I meet with our planning teams from Anderson, Pickens, and Oconee County, and Seneca, and Easley, and Liberty, and Anderson, and Central, and Pendleton about 3 times a year. I invite them over for lunch. We sit down and we just talk shop about what's going on, and we communicate very openly, because what's happening just, like where Aldi's is and all that, that's not Clemson, that's Oconee County. And right past Ingalls, that's the city of Central, and right past Max Drive-In is Pendleton. We're not operating in a vacuum, so we work real closely together, and we have a lot of impact on their jurisdictions as well. But this is a very important issue, and it's going to have significant impact on land values. If we develop this way, then the least logical or sustainable model of development is suburban sprawl, because you have more miles of road and utility lines, and it's super expensive to maintain. You got further to go for fire and rescue, and that the group that did this study was a combination of Upstate Forever and 10 at the top. They also have a fascinating financial model that goes with this. That if these projections are accurate, which they did this 20 years ago and they were extremely accurate, and assuming that that level of efficiency and accuracy continues, that we can expect exorbitantly high property taxes and with a decrease in services. And the alternative is if we start densifying and concentrating development in certain areas. And then throughout all this is public input. I spend probably a quarter of my time soliciting and listening to the public input. It's not my town. Part of our job is to fulfill the wishes that, yes, we come at it with a different set of experience and knowledge, and we have to apply that. And I frequently am telling them what they don't want to hear, but it's very important that I hear what they have to say. Now, two projects I want to run through, and the first one I'm going to go through quickly because Mr. Bousman recommended this other one. But Kiowee Trail, I don't know if you're familiar with this project. You know where Blue Heron used to be until that disappeared? From like Papa John's Pizza going up to El Jimador is that little side road. And you have the Abernathy Park, that little waterfront park on the left. And the right-hand side, somebody amassed 3.5 acres of land and wanted to put in a housing development up there as a planned development. This got obviously distorted, but that's generally the idea. And the Kiowee Trail is along the top there. This is like Potbelly Deli's up in that white triangle. So they first came to us with a plan, and this is how things evolved. They started meeting our requirements of setbacks, but they didn't meet it up there. They didn't have the right number of parking spaces. They had some other issues, so they start off by coming at us. The hatched marks, the red is where they had commercial. They were supposed to have commercial. Our code requires in this district that commercial be along the entire ground floor and residential above. And then this is all the residential floors above it, and then they were gonna have a rooftop restaurant over there. So they brought this to the public, and they started working on, this is like the third iteration, because they found that they couldn't make it work with straight zoning, so they came at it as a planned development, which is something the Enabling Act of South Carolina allows to grant municipalities the leeway to take a project like this and that might have extenuating circumstances and create its own district and create guidelines specific to that property. And that's what we were doing here, to allow them to push back in exchange for a plaza that would tie into this plaza over here, to separate the buildings so they could have some non-student housing. And because of where this was, we didn't feel like it needed commercial at every square foot of ground floor. We generally do, because Clemson is gonna, we got thousands and thousands of more students coming to Clemson. And we've got very limited commercial roadways. And if we let them build student housing all the way to the street level, well, first of all, nobody wants to have a sidewalk in somebody's living room right there. That'd be highly entertaining, I'm sure, but it's not a good model, and we're gonna need that commercial space. But here, because it was off the main drag, they were exploring ways to get relief from that, to come up with a different plan. So then it began to more further. You can see they started strengthening this, started putting in a streetscape, putting in a plaza up here to where this area up here could serve as it was a drive-through, but also but it served as a plaza, and it would really be limited to deliveries. Had them move all their vehicular movement this way, so this could actually function as a plaza. So this was multiple iterations, and then they began taking, if you remember that original image, so over the course of about 5 months, they began slowly starting to change this plan based on community input, staff input, and just working through this process. And then it stalled completely because the community revolted and said, even though they were participating in this, they said, we do not want any more student housing in the city of Clemson. And so they refused to vote for it. And so the developers backed off. But a reason I showed this, and I wish I could flash back quicker, but if you can get an image of that first drawing they had to the evolution to where they ended up, this was a very healthy relationship with a proactive, a really sincere development team. Spent a lot of time with the community and staff and the boards, and worked really hard to try to take some raw idea and craft it into something we felt like would fit into Clemson. It just couldn't get past the politics. Now, 405 College, that's where the Blue Heron used to be. This was the original site plan they submitted, and when they submitted that, they got this all the way through the Board of Architectural Review. They were going with straight zoning, so they didn't need a vote from council. They just needed the BA, the Board of Architectural Review, to approve it. And they got everything done except for that one corner. We have very specific guidelines about how you deal with corners. We didn't want just boxes. And they were very close to getting it done when the city ran out of sewer. That we had like 2,500 bedrooms come online 1 month, 2-3 years ago. And the city had been working to expand we have 2 wastewater treatment plants, but the one that services downtown where all those beds came online was reaching capacity, and we've been working with the university for 2 years to do a land swap, and that was cumbersome. Good relationship, but it just took a while because it took multiple votes from the Board of Trustees. And then we had to tear down, build a new plant, a new office and lab, tear down the old one, begin all the research. And it's been a long process, and it'll be completed in a year. So we weren't asleep at the switch, but we were planning on it. We also weren't planning on those 2,500 beds coming in the month of August of 2016. So that happened, and I don't know how many of y'all were here when we played Notre Dame that night, and it was raining. And a weird thing about Clemson is that we have to be prepared for that. And so we're an old town, we got sewer lines that are over 100 years old, and so that means you got a lot of infiltration. When it's saturated and soaking, you get a whole lot of just fresh water coming into those lines, which can top over the treatment plants. And then you got 100,000 additional guests in town for the night, and they're all flushing the toilets around the same time. It puts a new strain on the system. And so collectively, we were down to our last 100,000 gallons of sewer capacity, and council began allocating it, and they didn't participate in that program, so they backed off to wait and see what was going to happen. So they backed off from this. This was about 1.5 years ago. In the interim, after Earl Street and U Center and Grand Mark were all built, that was an opportunity for staff and the community to look at those projects and say, okay, what do we like and what don't we like? And in the interim, we upgraded a lot of our zoning ordinance. We changed some standards. And as a result of that, about 6 or 8 months ago, when the Gilbane Group, 405 College, came back to us, we said, we're glad to have you back, but the rules have changed. And now you got to redesign to meet the new standards, because they had never gotten approval from the BAR, and they had been inactive for over 1 year, and so it was basically a reset button. And great people to work with. They weren't put off. This is what it was. This was the original plan of what it was going to look like. That's looking from College Avenue. We made changes to where that flat line roof and boxiness. A lot of the buildings were starting to look alike. Like Plaza 189, where Mellow Mushroom used to be, Amici's is now, and Grand Mark, or U Center, the one downtown. You squint, they're almost identical. That's a very popular building style. And we wanted to, best we could, avoid people 20 years from now walking through here going, oh, that was built in the late teens or whenever. And and to encourage and grant latitude for our developers and architects to be more creative and to develop projects that were unique to Clemson. And that what we found is our ordinances, the way we had written them, it was almost requiring this. And so it was a flaw in our well-intended ordinances. So we cleaned all those up, and they had to go back to the drawing board. So that's what it was going to look like for Kiwi Trail. And at the time, this was from the lakeside, that we had real concerns about how they were going to treat that parking deck, because